In 1727, Charles Blount, an English merchant and longtime resident of Hamburg, applied to join the Company of Merchant Adventurers of England to Hamburg. The company had received special privileges from the city senate in 1611 to reside and trade in Hamburg. As a British subject with established business and social ties in the city, Blount seems an ideal candidate for membership in the company. However, his application was unceremoniously denied. Blount did not take this denial gracefully. He fought back. Through contacts at the British court, Blount petitioned King George II to overrule the decision of the merchant adventurers. Blount repeatedly cited his right as an Englishman and British subject to belong to the merchant adventurers. In return, the merchant adventurers deployed a variety of justifications for their implacable refusal of Blount's petitions. The conflict between Blount and the merchant adventurers raises a major question about the English merchant community in early modern Hamburg. Exactly how diverse was this community? The existing historiography often uses the terms English merchant and merchant adventurer interchangeably in the context of Hamburg. However, Blount's case illustrates a more complex situation on the ground. Blount's petitions and correspondence related to the dispute and the Company of Merchant Adventurers' responses shed light on the actual contours of the English merchant community in Hamburg at the beginning of the 18th century. In particular, the flurry of petitions and refusals that Blount and the company exchanged illustrate the ways in which religion, marriage, apprenticeship, and perceptions of foreignness created boundaries between the company and the wider merchant community in Hamburg. In the 18th century, the Company of Merchant Adventurers to Hamburg found themselves in a fundamentally altered position. Although they still possessed special privileges to live, worship, and work in Hamburg, the economic importance of the company was undercut following the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England. One of the government's first measures was to issue the Statute of 1688, which dissolved the company's monopoly on the export of English broadcloth and woolens. English broadcloth was the kingdom's most important export in the medieval and early modern periods. The company had enjoyed a monopoly on this essential commodity since the 16th century, and that monopoly was the basis of the company's power and influence in the port and market towns of Northern Europe. Its loss diminished the company's power and precipitated a decline in membership during the 18th century. From 1722 to 1806, only 81 members of the company were resident in Hamburg. Within this group of merchants, 6 families accounted for at least half of the company's membership. This suggests that during this period, the company became a closed social group. Despite its decrease in size and economic influence, the company continued to serve ceremonial and diplomatic functions in Hamburg. Although the company rarely admitted new merchants into its ranks in this period, the company's governing council did extend honorary memberships to British diplomats, agents, and other officials visiting Hamburg. In fulfilling this function, the company publicly demonstrated its historic privileges and welcomed visiting officials and short-term residents of high status to take part in them. However, as Charles Blount's case will illustrate, the 18th century company had no desire to share their unique privileges with those who could really benefit from them: other English merchants living and working in Hamburg. Perhaps this exclusivity was a way for the company to cultivate and maintain their privileged status in the city, even as they were losing real economic power. Unaffiliated English merchants became competition for company merchants after 1688. Instead of absorbing these merchants into its ranks, the company's leadership decided to restrict membership and concentrate its waning power and remaining privileges into as few hands as possible. In general, 18th century Hamburg thrived from the presence of various foreign merchants. These groups of merchants and their families resided in the city on the basis of alien contracts, such as the 1611 agreement between the Hamburg Senate and the Company of Merchant Adventurers, that granted the company's merchants special privileges to reside, build a church, and do business in the city. However, by the 18th century, a number of English merchants unaffiliated with the company were settled and working in the city, even though their residency status was unclear. Conflict with the Hamburg Senate over his residency status precipitated Blunt's attempt to join the Company of Merchant Adventurers in 1727. Although Blunt was a married man established in trade in Hamburg and had lived in the city since he was an apprentice, in the 1720s his lack of official residency became an issue. According to Blunt, by 1727, the Senate had already tried to compel him to become a citizen several times. When Blunt refused to comply, the Senate seized money and property from his home. He appealed to Sir Cyril Wick, the British envoy to the Hansa towns, for aid, and Sir Cyril intervened on Blunt's behalf with the Senate. Wick convinced the Senate to allow Blunt time to apply for membership in the Company of Merchant Adventurers. Membership in the company would have quickly and easily settled the issue of Blunt's residency. But, as noted earlier, the company tersely rejected Blunt's application. Blunt did not take no for an answer and petitioned the British government to intervene on his behalf with the company following their initial refusal. On May 29, 1727, Sir John Emerson, the deputy governor of the company, responded to this petition and defended the company's rejection of Blunt's application for membership. Emerson's reasons for refusal highlight the roles religion, apprenticeship patterns, and marriage choices played in defining the boundaries between the merchant adventurers and the wider foreign merchant community in Hamburg. The company's response to Blunt's petition also illustrates that in the 1720s, the deputy governor and other company officials were highly sensitive to issues of exclusivity and privilege. In the first place, the company's official response raises the issue of religious diversity within the English merchant community. Under the terms of the company's contract with the city, the merchant adventurers were allowed to build a church where they could worship according to the rites of the Church of England. Since 1611, this English church had been central to the merchant adventurers' organization and social life. However, not all of the English merchants in Hamburg were Anglicans. In the late 17th century, Quaker missionaries began proselytizing in the Netherlands and northern Germany. 17th century discrimination against religious dissenters encouraged many Quakers to leave Britain and settle in the developing British periphery, which included both transatlantic colonies and the market towns of the Low Countries and northern Germany. By 1662, Quaker missionaries and expatriates had established a Quaker meeting in Hamburg. In the 1720s, the membership applications of merchants like Blunt introduced the possibility of merging the traditional Anglican merchant community based around company and church with the dissenter merchants who had settled in Hamburg independently in the late 17th century. By rejecting merchants like Blunt, the company also rejected the concept of religious diversity amongst its members. Emerson begins his official response by noting that Blunt is, quote, a native of Great Britain residing in Hamburg and a Quaker. This may seem innocuous, but this is the first time Blunt's religion is identified in the dispute. Blunt himself never mentions his religious affiliation in his initial petitions. Shortly after Blunt's application was denied, the company also rejected the applications of John Innes and William Henderson, two other English Quaker merchants residing in Hamburg. Blunt himself did not see this as a benign coincidence. In a 1730 letter to a contact at the English court, Blunt confided that he believed the company intended, quote, not only to impose upon me, but also upon all other Quakers that might be admitted into their society. Although Deputy Governor Emerson had soundly denied that Blount's religion factored into the company's refusal to admit him, the subsequent denials of membership to Quaker merchants seems to suggest that religion was in fact a barrier to entry in the Merchant Adventurers Society. Another barrier to entry was apprenticing with a merchant who was not affiliated with the Company of Merchant Adventurers. In his response to Blount's petition, Deputy Governor Emerson described the general pattern of apprenticeship for company merchants. First, an apprentice's parents or guardians would pay a considerable fee to bind the apprentice to a company-affiliated merchant for at least 8 years. In contrast, Blount served his apprenticeship with Friedrich Schumacher, an independent merchant who was a citizen of Hamburg. Indeed, Emerson was horrified at the prospect of admitting a person, quote, so ill-qualified as the petitioner who served his apprenticeship with a burgher of Hamburg. In Emerson's view, it would clearly be unfair to those members who had paid their conventional dues to accept an outsider into their ranks for a mere entry fee. Emerson argued that accepting merchants like Blount into the company would diminish the future value of apprenticeship, since parents would avoid going through the expense of apprenticing their children to a merchant adventurer if, quote, the freedom were now to be purchased at a mean fine. Furthermore, Emerson maintained that Blount had already essentially surrendered his rights and identity as an Englishman on 2 counts before he applied for admission to the company. Firstly, he had served his apprenticeship with a native Hamburger. Secondly, Emerson alleged that Blount had married his master's daughter. Arguments over Blount's marriage and its meaning provide crucial insight into contemporary attitudes towards marriage between English merchants overseas and local women. This aspect of the dispute also illuminates the role issues of civic identity and status played in differentiating an acceptable intermarriage from a problematic intermarriage. In Blount's case, Emerson argued that by marrying a burgher's daughter, Blount had, quote, voluntarily engaged himself to the jurisdiction of the city and of his own accord translated his subjection from King George to the city senate. In other words, Emerson categorically rejected the idea that Blount had any right to request the king or his cabinet's intervention in the first place, since by the act of marrying a burgher's daughter, he had already become a Hamburger himself. Emerson also worried that by accepting the son-in-law of a burgher into the company would be courting trouble with the city senate. In fact, Emerson was mistaken about the identity of Frau Blount. She was not the daughter of a burgher, nor had Blount married his master's daughter. Johanna Blount was actually the youngest daughter of the Elking family, an influential merchant clan from Hamburg's Dutch Mennonite community. It is unclear whether Emerson knew he was inaccurate regarding Johanna Blount's origins. Her brother, Gisbert Hermann Elking, did act as an agent for the Hamburg Senate, collecting and delivering letters and gathering information for the Senate when his business took him to Amsterdam or London. Charles Blount may not have married a burgher's daughter, but by marrying into the Elking family, he had allied himself with a respected and established merchant family in the city. Perhaps Emerson's depiction of the Elkings as a burgher family was an attempt to communicate the importance of the Elking family to an English audience unfamiliar with Hamburg's complex socio-political landscape. Or perhaps Emerson was merely repeating rumors that he believed would strengthen the merchant adventurer's case against Blount's admission. In any case, both the real Johanna Blount and the fictitious master's daughter described by Emerson were foreign, thus lending weight to Emerson's final objection to Blount's marriage. In a move which he clearly considered a checkmate, Emerson cited the company's original Elizabethan charter, which forbade merchants from marrying foreign women on pain of being disenfranchised. In his petition to George II's cabinet, Blount had defended his right to join the company despite his marriage, on the grounds that the clause forbidding intermarriage from the original charter had never been enforced. To illustrate his point, Blount included 2 affidavits identifying 10 company merchants who had married Dutch women without losing their membership in the company. Several of these merchants were members of the company when Blount applied in 1727. Nevertheless, Emerson dismissed Blount's argument and insisted that even though the clause against intermarriage had not been strictly enforced in the past, it had not, quote, thereby lost its force, at least where Blount was concerned. Emerson concluded his arguments against Blount by reiterating that, quote, the company did not object against admitting the petitioner on account of his being a Quaker, but the principal objection relied upon by them was that he had served his apprenticeship with a burgher of Hamburg and married a burgher's daughter. Notwithstanding the inaccuracies in this claim, the company's position was clear. While Blount may have seen himself as English, the company defined him as an outsider, who was too radical religiously and too German socially. Accepting Blount, Emerson claimed, would open a door for all kinds of, quote, aliens, foreigners, and English renegades to demand membership in the company and access the accompanying residency privileges in Hamburg. From Emerson's perspective, maintaining exclusivity in membership was necessary in order to preserve the company and its privileges. Blount, a religious dissenter with a Dutch-German family, would set a dangerous precedent were he to be admitted into the company. Blount, however, remained undeterred. He would persistently pursue membership in the company for the next 8 years. In 1730, Blount wrote to Lord Harrington, the British Secretary of State, and complained that the company in Hamburg had severely decreased in membership, possibly even impairing the company's ability to do business. According to Blount, the number of company merchants had declined from several scores to about 13. 13 was the minimum number of merchants necessary to staff the company council and manage the company's internal governance. Blount alleged that in order to maintain the minimum membership, the company had recently admitted 2 persons not yet out of their apprenticeship and the brother of a company merchant who had never even served an apprenticeship. If Blount's information is correct, between 1727 and 1730, the company had rejected the applications of several established Quaker merchants, including Blount, but had extended membership to apprentices and untrained family members in order to maintain the bare minimum numbers necessary to run the company. Blount argued that the company's extreme exclusivity presented a danger to English trade in Hamburg. He warned Lord Harrington that our nation could easily lose the privileges they enjoy by that company's obstinacy in refusing admission to English subjects and their endeavoring to monopolize the privileges to so small a number. The paper trail related to this particular dispute ends in 1735, when Blount declared in a letter his intention to travel to Hanover in order to beg King George's aid in person. As Blount strides off stage into the unknown, we are left holding the remains of an unsettled dispute that provides intriguing insight into a merchant community in flux. Blount's prolonged attempt to join the company of merchant adventurers reveals that by the 18th century, the company was a small, elite society that often operated with the minimum number of members. Nevertheless, the company refused to expand membership even as many of Hamburg's English merchants were desperate for entry as the city senate began to strictly enforce measures against foreign residents. Thank you for your time and attention.